Hello and welcome to this afternoon's London Art Week event. My name is Luce Garrigue and I'm London Art Week Digital Director, and I'm very proud to introduce our first talk in partnership with le Musée du Luxembourg in Paris. For the 5 coming years, François Grolot, director of the Musée du Luxembourg, and his team have chosen to dedicate their exhibition program to women artists. The first exhibition they are presenting, Peintres Femmes, 1780-1830, Naissance d'un combat, Women Painter, The Birth of a Battle, is currently on view, and you will be pleased to know that it has also been extended to the 25th of July. So you still have time to visit this groundbreaking show if you can. And for the ones who won't be able to go to Paris, there is a virtual visit on the Musée du Luxembourg website. I also highly recommend the wonderful publications that accompanies the exhibition, if you can read French. And I will now hand over to Emanuela Tarizzo, who is going to moderate this talk. Some of you might be familiar with Emanuela by now, and she's director at the Tommaso Gallery, specialized in sculpture, and London Art Week Vice Chair. Hello, Emanuela.
Hi, thank you, Luce. Thank you for the introduction.
You're very welcome.
And thank you everyone for joining us. So as Luce said, I will be moderating tonight's talk, and it is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in due course. Just before we start, I'd like to say, if you have any questions, do write them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be monitoring that, and at the end, we will leave about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions you may have for our speakers. Now, with me today to discuss the women who took up the brush between the fall of the Ancien Régime and the 1830 July Revolution in France are, in alphabetical order, Melissa Hyde, who is Professor of Art History and Distinguished Teaching Scholar at the University of Florida. Melissa specializes in 18th century art with a focus on women and gender, topics on which is published profusely. And Martine Lacas. Martine received her PhD in the history and theory of art from the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales in Paris, and has published widely on the history of painting from the Renaissance to the 19th century. She's the curator of the exhibition Peintres Femmes at the Musée du Luxembourg, which Luce just mentioned. And the exhibition is the starting point and the guiding principle, if you will, of our talk today. And last but not least, Séverine Sofio, who is a sociologist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris and a graduate of the École du Louvre. She specializes in the social history of artists in early modern Europe, and in 2016 published a book on women artists in France, 1750 to 1850. Her forthcoming book will analyze the long-term construction of artistic fame and the persistence of names in collective history. Now, to begin, I think, Melissa, if you would like to, give us an overview of the period that we're about to discuss, and specifically the developments that are relevant and affected women artists.
Yes. Hello. Greetings, everyone, from Florida, where it is sunny and warm and lunchtime rather than the evening. But so I guess that the first things that I would say about the period that's covered in the exhibition, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is its historical range. It's a period, the period that's covered by the exhibition is a period of major upheavals and transformations. As Emanuela already noted in the title, it spans the years of the last years of the Ancien Régime, so the late 1770s and 80s, which is the era of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. It goes through the French Revolution, Napoleon and the First Empire, the Bourbon and Restoration, and the very end of the Bourbon Restoration. So it has a very broad sort of historical scope, and there are a great many important things that happened during that period, and those all have an effect on the kind of work that women produced as artists during this period. And I think that some of the most important factors that are relevant to understanding the practice of women artists and the kinds of issues that circulated around their practice has to do with the changing ideas. I really think, and by that I mean cultural, scientific ideas about women's capacities and their abilities and what their social roles should be. So it's this period of changing ideas about ideals of womanhood, in other words, and that includes debates about whether women should even practice professions or whether their primary roles should be as wives and mothers. And as I said, these ideas all have an effect on the kind of art that women produced, the genres that they tended to practice or were expected to practice. Often, though not exclusively, that would be, portraiture and still life, and we'll see some examples of other kinds of genres that they practiced. But it also affected the media in which they worked, whether they worked in oil paint or pastel, or if they worked as miniaturists. And I guess the other important things that I would note about the period as a kind of introduction is that before the revolution, there were very few women who could exhibit their work publicly. There were a restricted number of venues where they could show their work. We'll hear more about that in a little while. But the major, most important venue, of course, was the Salon of the Louvre. And because there were only 4 women who could be members of the Academy at any given moment during the period that's covered in the exhibition, that meant that only 4 women could exhibit. And the ones who were still really active during the 1770s, well, 1780s really, you see on the slide here on the screen. During the revolution, the Salon would be liberalized by the revolutionary government. And so women were able to exhibit in large numbers for the first time. And they did, and they continued to do so throughout the period that's covered in our exhibition. And I would just add, lastly, one other sort of item to think about is that while, of course, many women in the exhibition practiced art to make a living, this is also, I think, a period in which women used visual art, the practice of visual art, to express their individuality and their agency at a time when they had very few civil rights. So there are other kind of things going on besides just making a living. So I think I'll pause there and invite Séverine and Martine to jump in if there's anything that I've left out for sort of beginning thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think here we have a slide with some more works from the sort of later period that we're going to cover in today's discussion. So we wanted to kind of give you a sense of works at both ends of this fascinating period. Now, because you talked about the situation for women that aspire to be painters in general, I think we can, with Séverine, we can start with the beginnings. So can you tell us a bit more about how training worked for women in this period? How did it evolve from where it was at the beginning during the Ancien Régime? And what connections and networks did training help form between these women?
Sure, thank you, Emanuela. Before I answer your question, I think I have to mention one crucial element. First, women have always been present and active in the art world. There have always been women in the traditional family workshops of painters alongside the master and the other men working there as apprentices or workers. Each painting was a collective work, one being in charge of the preparation of the pigments, one being in charge of the preparation of the canvas, another of the sketching of the contours, another of the background, the landscape, another of the face of the model, the clothes, etc. You understood this division of tasks. The master being ultimately recognized as the author, even if, paintings were not always signed to every amateur's utter despair. So women were there, they were the master's daughters or wives or sisters, they knew all about the trade of art, but their work was invisible for us and still is, unfortunately, since very few women became mistresses then, that is to say, members of the corporation of artists and therefore legally authorized to have a workshop and apprentices and to receive commissions and sell paintings under their name. So this was the situation for women in the arts in most Europe during several centuries. But in France, in the end of the 18th century, when our exhibition begins, Well, two elements had major consequences for women artists. First, the law regarding corporations changed in 1777, and art became one of the few skilled trades that was exempt from registration with a corporation. The official status of artiste libre was created. Art was a liberal trade, so anyone could now declare themselves an artist. So after 1777 in France, men and women could legally be artists, masters and mistresses of their own studios, and authors of their own paintings without having to register with a corporation. The second crucial element is less easily datable, since it is more a social and cultural phenomenon. To summarize it very briefly, it is the development of a taste for the arts among the privileged classes who reinvested Paris in the middle of the 18th century at a time when Versailles was less attractive for them. Aristocracy and upper middle classes became interested in drawing, in antiquity, in painting. Knowing how to draw, being an art lover, a connoisseur and a patron became a valued skill for men of these classes and gradually also for women during the 18th century. As a result of this movement, wealthy families entrusted their daughters to famous painters to learn how to draw and paint. And this is an essential phenomenon for us because from this time onwards, women who were not daughters of artists entered painting studios as students and started to learn the art trade at a very high level. The first painter who took female students who were not daughters of artists was not David, as is often said, but Jean-Baptiste Greuze. So I can maybe have the first slide. Okay, thank you, Emanuela. So the first painter who took female students who were not daughters of artists was indeed Jean-Baptiste Greuze, who had several female students as soon as the 1770s. And here you can see the paintings of two of Greuze's students, Jeanne Philibert Ledoux and Geneviève Bouliard. In fact, as can be seen here, Ledoux's style was very close to that of her master, which no doubt led to some of her works still being attributed to Greuze himself. After Greuze, Joseph Benoît Suvet, Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Baptiste Regnault, Anne-Louis Giraudet, and then for the following generations, Charles Meunier, Guillaume Guillon-Lethière, Léon Cogniet, etc., opened studios for girls and young women beside their male students. And of course, this period also saw the emergence of an absolute novelty. It's the atelier féminin of a female master. The first one of this kind being the famous atelier of Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, who was teaching to no less than 9 young women at the same time in the 1780s. Next slide. Thank you. So here you can see the notorious self-portrait of Labille-Guiard with 2 students. One of them, the one closer to us on the painting, is Gabriele Cape, who became like a daughter for Adélaïde Labille-Guiard and lived with her for more than 20 years. So I also wanted to show you also the painting that Gabriele Cape created 23 years later as a homage to her master and a reminiscence of the 1785 self-portrait. Unfortunately, I do not have enough time to describe and study these amazing paintings in detail, but by showing them, I wanted to illustrate the very important idea of transmission from a generation of women painters to another that was made possible at the time, for the first time actually in the history of the arts. The organization of these ateliers was the same for the male and the female students and was incredibly stable until the 1840s at least. Next slide. Thank you. For the students, whether male or female, their daily practice revolved entirely around the copy of a drawing or a print, and then copy of a 3-dimensional object, often a plaster reproduction of a statue from classical antiquity. So the drawing of the male or female nude body was mastered that way in all modesty, and then copy of the human model for the most advanced students. When all the different techniques of drawing were mastered, the students could move on to the practice of painting. Here, I wanted to show you a rarity, which is a drawing by a student with written comments by her master. David in this case, the student being Marianne Lavoisier, the wife of the famous chemist, who took lessons with David to be able to record by drawing her husband's experiments. And we can see with the image on the right, Madame Lavoisier has even pictured herself drawing in the setup of the experiment. As you can see, she's on the right with her little table. And yeah, thank you. Next slide. Well, as I said, the organization of this atelier remained very stable during the first half of the 19th century. Fortunately for us, there are several representations of these ateliers féminins. We can see two examples here, one by Caroline Cognier on the left and one by Adrienne Grandpierre de Verzy on the right. It is important to have in mind that they were not classes in the strict sense of the word, but a kind of self-managed workshops in which the students were organized by level under the supervision either of the wife of the master, if she was herself a painter, which was often the case, or under the supervision of one of the students, and often one of the most advanced of course. The master himself came once or twice a week. This is the scene Grandpierre de Verzy depicted here. The master would look at and comment on the works in progress and give some general advice, which could be noted religiously by some of the students. Indeed, Caroline Cognier gives a rather evocative representation of this very horizontal and autonomous organization of the students' studios, which, after several years of this regime, created a strong collective identity among the students and friendships that lasted a lifetime. Next slide. As a complement to the studio work, students of both sexes could also attend some of the private anatomy classes and drawing sessions from the model, which were open to men and women under the authorization of the Préfecture de Paris in the aftermath of the revolution. Some of them were still open 20 years later, as we can see here with this lithograph by Jean-Henri Marlet from the series Tableaux de Paris. Well, there would be a lot more to say, but I'll stop here my answer to your question, Emanuela, since it is already far too long.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic, a sort of real overview and a gallop through many decades of significant changes and significant developments in the sort of training and workshops of France. Now, Martine, so moving on from, I think, from the training to the actual spaces in which women artists could display their work, what were these spaces? Again, how did they change, and how were these women sort of understood as artists by their contemporaries?
As Melissa said, in 1791, the rules for access to the salon changed, and it was open to every artist without distinction, women and men sharing the same space. During the 1780s, over space like the Exposition de la Jeunesse, which took place one day a year in August, or the private Salon de la Correspondance, initiated by Parrain de la Blancherie, had contributed to giving artists more visibility, and that played a great part in the rise of important new phenomena, which attracted significant attention and public debate during the 80s and 90s. The question of artistic education for women, the rise of female artistic vocation, and the controversies surrounding the effects of the increased presence of women in the arts. Even if voices supporting the traditional distinction between feminine and masculine gender persisted, alongside the belief in women's physical and intellectual weakness and men's power to raise art to its highest level, other voices, and prominent ones, were very supportive and encouraged women painters. In the end, despite these controversies, the increased presence of women in the arts was a reality and kept growing. Nevertheless, traditional concepts linked to the female gender, sensibility, delicacy, intimacy, etc., largely inform the reception of the works of women artists, and they explain the harsh judgments women artists received when they ventured into history painting, traditionally associated with male artists, or the tendency to praise the talent of women by calling it mal or genius of virile spirit. Still, women during these decades were not invisible or made invisible, as they would be later in the 19th century.
Thank you. Thank you, Martine. And going back to you, Séverine, can we talk, so Martine has told us a bit about how women artists were perceived and, you know, the commentary that they received when they exhibited their work publicly. But how can we actually try and understand how they perceive themselves as artists? I know it's a very important question and not an easy one to answer, but
yes, indeed. This is not an easy question, but well, I think of two ways to try and find how women artists perceive themselves at that time. There are, on the one hand, the self-portraits, which give interesting insights on how painters wanted how painters wanted their peers and the public to see them. And there is, on the other end, their correspondence, where we can see how they wrote about themselves. So, how did women artists picture themselves? Well, the good thing here is that we have a lot of examples from the end of the Ancien Régime and the first decades of the 19th century, since, well, the image of the woman artist was kind of trendy at that time. We can find examples even in fashion print in the mainstream press. Women artists used self-portrait as a practical way to advertise their talent and their name. I have already mentioned L'Abbe Guillard's 1785 self-portrait with two students, which is a splendid paragon of this trend. In this life-size painting, she depicts herself with a sumptuous, low-cut satin blue dress and a large hat with feathers and ribbons, but also with her palette and brushes in her hand and her two students behind her. So in other words, she depicts herself as a beautiful, fashionable lady and as a recognized professional and a master in her heart. So a few years later, the context has changed. With the revolution, a debate arose among artists. Should women be first and foremost mothers of citizens of the young French Republic? And should they therefore only devote themselves to their domestic duties and abandon all pretension to creativity? Or should the French nation cultivate and recognize all talents, wherever they come from, because art, is a priority for the glory of the nation? Nicole Dumont, a painter at that time, chose to illustrate a third option with her lovely and clever self-portrait, as we can see here. This third option being that a woman can be both a good artist and a good mother. In this painting, she actually depicts herself as a caring mother, as a loving wife, as a grateful daughter, as an excellent painter, and as a good citizen, all in one painting. Indeed, she pictures herself taking care of her young son while painting a beautiful portrait of her husband, the painter François Dumont, with a setting that resonates with the famous portrait that her father had done of her 8 years earlier, and you can see it here on the right. And all of this takes place in a painting where the three colors of the Republic, the blue, the white, and the red, are clearly dominant. Now, how did women artists talk about themselves? The answer can be found in the archives, in particular the archives of the administration of the arts from the Restoration onwards. In fact, at this time, artists of both sexes were constantly in interaction with the administration to deal with every detail of their professional life and career. In general, for women painters of this period, to be artists meant asserting their right to the same respect and resources as their male colleagues, because they had followed the same path, the same training, and the same trials, especially the harsh selection of the salon where they competed under the same conditions. In their letters to the administration, therefore, women painters often put forward the argument of the high requirements of the training they had undergone and the degree of mastery they could henceforth boast. The archive contained hundreds of letters from women artists making this argument during the 1820s and 1830s. Because they were excellent painters and honorable citizens, they were obviously entitled to the protection and support of the state. It is history, however, that has interpreted these same discourses and arguments differently, depending on whether they were made by male or female artists. I would like here to mention an example of the example of Victoire Jacoto, a painter known only to specialists today, but who built a career and a fortune on her unique talents and the mastery of a very specific technique. Thank you for the slide. I have to say first a quick word on the context here. At the end of the 18th century, the conservation of the artworks of the past became a concern. Although copies on canvas and prints made it possible to transmit the image of the most famous paintings, canvases tended to lose their brilliance with time, and prints could not render the precision of the line and the truth of the colors. In this context, the idea to reproduce paintings on big porcelain plaques was developed. These porcelain copies had the advantage of preserving both the brilliance of the colors and the finesse of the design. It was now possible to have imperishable copies of the paintings of the great masters. The technique was considered revolutionary, and porcelain copies soon had their own place at the salon and at the museum. The first artist to specialize in this very difficult technique and to master it remarkably was Victoire Jacoto. In 1816, she was appointed painter on porcelain of the King's Cabinet and was rewarded with an annual pension. From then on, she was the one who decided on the subject of her own copies, the frequency with which she returned them, and the price at which the state bought them. For example, her porcelain copy of Raphael's Holy Family was bought in 1825 for 35,000 francs. As a comparison, the most expensive painting at the Salon on the same year, a battle painting by De La Roche, was bought by the state for 10,000 francs. In her correspondence with the administration, Jacoto revealed herself to be a skillful negotiator and a tough businesswoman. But this ruthlessness in discussing her working conditions has earned an appalling reputation among male historians. To give an idea, here is how one of her biographers described her. Quote, Mrs. Jacoto's correspondence reveals her to be acrimonious, irascible, conceited, unparalleled in pretension and susceptibility. From the end of the empire, we see her haggling over the prices offered to her, and on the return of the Bourbon, her demands took an unprecedented form. End of quote. This is a biography from 1913. In fact, the tone of Jacoto's letters to the administration was firm indeed, but far from excessive. She was simply aware of her talents and knew how to negotiate effectively with a state that was often a bad payer with the artists. To conclude my answer, I would like to evoke very briefly the case of Monique Molyra, a humble flower painter active in the 1820s and 1830s, to illustrate that women painters, though modest and specialized in a minor genre, would not hesitate to claim the protection of the most powerful people of the time. Flower painters of both sexes are often disregarded by historians, yet they felt no less legitimate as artists than their colleagues in the other genres. In the archives of the Louvre, I found, for instance, a whole file on the quarrel between Molyra and a museum attendant who accused her of placing her easel too close to the painting she was copying. They started arguing, and Molyra defended herself, but she faced a penalty, and she sought the protection of her patron, the Duc de Luynes, and asked him to intervene with the museum director. And surprisingly, she got what she wanted: a letter of the Duke and the apologies from the direction of the Louvre. Though a humble painter, hardly known by the public, Monique Molyra was able to obtain the protection of a very powerful figure, despite the absolutely and obviously trivial nature of her case. I will hand my answer here.
Thank you. And I think now I wanted to ask Melissa, because we've heard both from Martine and Séverine many insights into how these women artists were perceived and even commented on, or the feedback they had from their contemporaries. But what about the significance of the exhibition today, of the Musée du Luxembourg exhibition Peintres Femmes, and about what we may call received ideas about women artists?
Yes, well, thank you. Oh yeah, thank you for the slide. Well, I suppose that one of the most obvious received ideas is that there weren't very many women artists, and the show certainly challenges that received idea. And the slide that I'm showing you here is just a selection. This is not even going all the way through the period that's covered by the exhibition, but just a selection of portraits and self-portraits by women and of women artists from about 1770 to 1800, which gives some idea of the richness and as Séverine was saying, that it becomes a kind of fashion, in portraiture to represent women artists, and this is just a sampling of that. But I think that the show is so important in making visible so many names and the works of so many artists that only specialists have heard of, and maybe some that specialists have not heard of. So I think that that's one of the most important aspects of the show. There are other things one could talk about that the show, I think, challenges received wisdom about the kinds of genres that women practice, but also things like the sort of perception that they didn't travel to study art. That's a really big one that we have so many examples that illustrate the falsity of that received notion. And I think that it's also a really important intervention in the way in which art history has been written in the last even 50 years, or even going back to the example that Séverine was citing, that constructs Madame Jacoto in a very kind of biased and uncomplimentary way, which when you go back and look at the actual letters, you see that this is a man in 1913 writing about a 19th century artist and bringing all the baggage of a man of 1913 and his expectations about what a woman should be like and how she should write and how she should comport herself. And there are elements of that, all over the place in the way when women artists do get written about, those kinds of biases come up over and over again. So I think that the exhibition is extremely important as a kind of intervention in that, and I think Martine will maybe talk to us a bit about the naissance d'un combat and what that means, because that is I think one of the elements of the her intentions behind the show, which I was so happy to be involved with as a catalogue essayist. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm sure that Séverine and Martine would like to jump in as well.
Thank you. Yes, so actually I have here a slide where you can see the entrance to the exhibition. And Martine, as Melissa was saying, the subtitle, so to speak, of the exhibition is Naissance d'un combat. So can you tell us a bit more about that, but also about the first part of the title, Peintres Femmes?
Yes, choosing Peintres Femmes rather than Femme Peintre was to point out the change that took place in this period, with the strong emergence of women in the space of artistic production, with their public and institutional recognition as artists. My intention was to mark the difference between the earlier reception of women artists, when we were seen as wonders of nature, exceptional women, exception to their gender, and the period between the French Revolution and the 1830, when their number and their works questioned these ideas. Another reason was the intention to highlight these artist practice before their gender. It is here that the notion of a battle, of a birth of a battle takes shape. It is important that this subtitle is not to be the object of misunderstanding. Certainly, these artists were confronted with traditional ideas about the artistic potential of women and their weakness compared to men. They were subjected to criticism and calumnies that aimed to lock them in the most negative conception of their gender. But the exhibition also aims to fight against our own categories. The major trap is to understand them only from the point of view of their female condition, to isolate them in a specialized history, the history of women painters, to see their works only as a response to their social condition, as a social strategy. By proceeding in this way, they are once again, I think, removed from what art is, what history of art could be. Not only the product of a society in a given historical time, but the place of an untimely interrogation on the being, on the painting, on the figural fact, on what we can find today and tomorrow in their works, and that helps us to see deep inside ourselves, inside our imagination, inside our memory. Next slide, please. The greatest success of the exhibition for me is that people will now have in their poetic memory the painting of Nisa Villers, that of Isabelle Pinson, next slide, or Henriette Lorimier, next slide, and many others. Many visitors testify to having been moved by the ankle and the glove of Mrs. Sustras, by this erotic alliance of audacity and mystery, by the tactile dimension of Mr. Pouqueville's coat, by the very close presence of the material of his coat and the immaterial light of his glance, by the metaphysical nothingness of the flycatcher of Isabelle Pinson. And this is a real victory if we want to talk about a birth of a battle. I had the great pleasure during the museum open night, it's one event, one day a year in France, to see people contemplating for a long time certain works, letting themselves be taken by details, moments of painting. And we could see the video, please.
I have the video, and there's audio. I hope everybody can hear it. And also there was music played on the evening, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a sensory experience on many levels. Thank you. I'm just going to go back to this beautiful detail.
Okay. The music facilitated this lifting of barriers, of short point of view, like female art only. The exhibition aims at inscribing women artists firmly in the artistic production of this period and its major trends, history painting on the decline at the beginning of the 19th century, the emergence of troubadour style or a new type of portrait, the opposite but joint movements of uniformization of bourgeois society and promotion of individualism.
Thank you. Thank you, Martine. And I was looking, I think we timed this absolutely wonderfully. You've been amazing. And I had a couple more questions for our speakers. And if anybody in our audience has any questions, please write them in the Q&A box. I see two questions already. And actually there is one from Donna that ties in actually with one of the questions that I had prepared. The question from Donna is, what efforts are being made by major museums to purchase works by women to create more representative collections? And obviously this is a very wide topic and it could apply to museums all over the world, and this, you know, changes significantly from museum to museum, and we cannot speak for museums in general. So I might just try and sort of zoom into the subject of today's talk and the collections that are present in the exhibition at the Musée du Luxembourg. And I have the question for Martine, which was, you know, we've talked about these spaces in the past where the works of these women were exhibited, but what about the spaces in which they're exhibited today? What about public collections and private collections? And, you know, how you brought this exhibition together? And I have your slide here.
Okay. Some works, some of the works, beautiful ones, come from private collections. Like, for example, a portrait by Marie-Victoire Lemoine, another ones by Rosa-Adélaïde Ducreux and Marie-Elisabeth Chaudet. We show, we could see it. Other works came from Russian, American, Swiss, and German museum, and from France. Curating the exhibition, I discovered that there is currently a real continent to explore on the private market. It is the submerged part, but the largest one. And in France, numerous works are in the museum storage, where they are waiting for restoration and display. Next slide, please. No, next, and next. Again, no, well, it's okay. For example, one of the works of the exhibition, the portrait of François Gérard by Marie-Éléonore Godefroy. No, previous.
Right.
Right. Coming from the collections of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, has been saved by the exhibition. It was in a very bad condition, and for this occasion, an important restoration could give it a new life and a visibility. Another one, next slide, please. A very large portrait of Fleury by a very great and very successful portraitist, Adèle Romanet, comes from the collections of the Comédie Française. It was hung in their offices, invisible to public, and it has been lent without restoration. Nevertheless, it is displayed in prominent position in the exhibition, and I hope this choice will encourage a restoration, because under the old and yellow varnish, despite some notable alterations, we may see the firmness of the compositions, the colors, a very difficult game of subtle undertones, gray, dark green, dark red, brown. It's obvious that this work is as important as more famous portrait by Adèle Romanet, like the one of Auguste Vestris, next slide, or the one of Joseph Dominique Fabry-Garat, next one, and a young lady at pianoforte at the Museum of Boston. The exhibition is the occasion to give a real visibility to these works, which are in private collection, in the storage of museum. And I hope they became famous now.
I think that your exhibition will certainly, bring more attention in France, but also beyond. And as Luce was mentioning at the beginning, there is a beautiful catalogue, which I recommend everyone sort of get a copy and visit if you can. There is another question which I thought would be interesting, because I think Melissa mentioned briefly, but there is a beautiful chapter in the catalogue about this. The question is, are there any women landscape painters in this period? And obviously we've talked about women's, their training, but not their traveling. And I think that ties in with the landscape painting as well. So if one of you would like to maybe tell us a bit about that. Melissa?
Yes, there were a few women who were landscape painters. It is, I think, should be a subject of further study about why there were so few. I mean, it's very clear in the 19th century, when plein air painting becomes the norm, why it is more problematic for women to go out into the landscape and and paint. But there are many fewer in the 18th and 19th centuries. But there is one represented in the exhibition. And I don't know, maybe Martine or Séverine would like to talk a little bit about her. I'm happy to step aside for her. I'm a little out of my depth and my field of expertise when we get well into the 19th century. But yeah, do you want to speak about her?
We have an example of Joséphine Sarrazin-Belmont, of Hortense Haute-Bourlesco, which stay at the Académie de France during 8 years.
In Rome.
We have Julie Duvidal de Montferrier and Augustine Dufresne, Anna Bansi, who was a student of Suvet, who stay at the Académie de France. There are travels of women artists.
Thank you. And there is another question. It's quite long, but to sort of shorten it, do we have any idea of how many women artists were trained and worked for male artists who were not given credit for their work? I think we cannot really put a number to this phenomenon, especially because we don't know, previous women artists were working and training with male artists even before the period we're talking about and beyond France. So it could be an absolutely vast number. Specific to France, did any women actually win recognition prizes at the Salon? I think the answer is yes. Séverine, would you like to tell us a few words about this?
Yes, of course. Well, it's very simple to answer this question. Yes, there were a lot of women who received medals. It was the prize, the main prize at the Salon was medal, and there was a gold medal, silver medal, etc. And women were very were a lot to have medals at the Salon, and it was all the more, this phenomenon was all the more important when in the 1830s the medals were organized by genres. So, for example, there was a medal for porcelain painting. And since I talked about Victoire Jacoto, it's important to know that practically all the medals in this specialty were won by either Jacoto or her pupils, students.
Could I just add that that some of them are pictured? Some examples are actually pictured in the catalogue. Just to give you you can point to some of those in the catalogue. Bouliard's Femme with a woman with the rose crown, for example, is pictured in the catalogue as one of the prize winners, of which there were, as Séverine says, many. But if you want a specific example that you can lay your hands on straight away in the catalogue, there's a good example there.
Thank you. And I think there's another one for you, Séverine. You mentioned the correspondence between the administration and artists where can one find such correspondence? Obviously, again, it could be in many different archives, but Séverine, if you have...
Well, no, it's actually in one place now. It was in several places for a long time, and it's been collected in just one place. It's the Archives Nationales in Paris, in Pierrefitte, exactly. And the archives of the administration of the Louvre are now at the Archives Nationales. So everything is in the same building. It's the Archives Nationales now. It's easier, maybe. Maybe I just take the opportunity to answer very quickly to a question about Jean-Baptiste Greuze, who was the first artist to take female students in his studio. And I just wanted to add a very a tiny thing, but it's important. He was the first one to take female students who were not daughters of artists. It's this precision that is important. In the story of the training, the women painters training.
Could I just jump in very quickly and add that there are, I think, in fact, some earlier examples. For example, Pons Robert de Série had a school drawing for girls that was run by Madeleine Basporte. So there are some glimmers of earlier examples as well, but certainly Greuze is the one that's sort of the most visible and established. So I think there's still much more to be said about pre-1780.
Thank you. And there's another question about women artists promoting and talking about themselves. Is there any narrative evidence of how they assimilated themselves to overcome the prevailing discourse of aesthetic habits and conventions? I guess, you know, is there any evidence of how they assimilated themselves to the prevailing narratives on these topics, or did they, or didn't they?
Do you mean by narrative, documentary evidence, or I'm not quite sure what the question means about narrative evidence, but I would say that looking at the memoirs of somebody like Vigée Lebrun, who constructs herself very much in relationship, in that text, in relationship to these discourses, is probably the most conspicuous example, and certainly one that you know has been published and widely read. I'm sure Séverine and Martine can add other examples as well, but yeah.
Séverine?
Well, I was a bit confused by the term narrative evidence also, so I wasn't sure exactly what the question was about. So yes, well, the thing is, most women artists didn't have to assimilate themselves like a conscious effort. It was a bit natural. They were in the art world, they were part of it, so they were naturally assimilated in it. I don't know if it's exactly what Trevor wanted us to answer, but
well, hopefully, yes. The question was not the easy to unpack, but thank you for trying, and thank you, Trevor, for the question.
Emanuela, if you could translate what I want to say.
Sure.
Je pense que le problème qui est posé par la question rejoint aussi cette problématique de l'histoire de l'art.
Yeah, so Martine is saying that the problem that the question poses, that the problem the question poses, the way in which it is posed, is connected in itself to the way we sort of talk about women artists within art history.
Et dans la mesure aussi où l'évidence textuelle aurait plus de légitimité que la documentation, entre guillemets, que fournissent les œuvres, qu'il nous reste justement à redécouvrir, à rendre visibles. Mais il y a une documentation aussi. Enfin, quand on est peintre, on n'est pas forcé d'avoir à écrire, puisque le registre de l'expression qui est choisi, c'est celui de la peinture. Alors, il y a tous les documents que Séverine étudie et qui sont nécessaires, mais qui font partie du métier de négocier un prix, de négocier une récompense, de négocier un atelier, mais qui sont des documents qui ne
Yes,
qui sont liés au travail.
Yeah, thank you. So also that's a very good point. Obviously, the main sources of expression for these artists were their works, their paintings. So the documentary sources that Séverine mentioned, which are very important, are probably only part of the picture and only help us understand how they position themselves within the art world only to a certain extent, because the sort of prime, the most important form of expression and of also self-fashioning and positioning for them were their works. We have a question for Melissa about the intentions behind the show and how might this exhibition inspire a more technical reappraisal of these fascinating artists in larger institutions?
If I'm understanding the question, inspire more technical reappraisal, do you mean in terms of the kinds of questions of technique? I guess I'd like a refinement on the.
So Amber has just said, as in the women's painterly style, brushstroke composition, particularly given they practice their craft from copy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that just getting them out there and having people, as Martine talked about, communing with the works in a kind of sustained way is you know, one of the great contributions of the exhibition. I mean, my hope would be that, you know, once people begin to be familiar with these artists, that there's going to be more interest in studying them as artists, and that maybe we don't need more exhibitions on just women artists eventually. Like someday we'll just have shows about a period or a theme that include women without having to have the combat, you know. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but my hope is that, you know, taking them seriously as artists is precisely the goal of such an exhibition. And you know, the more art historians work on these artists, the more those kinds of questions are going to be addressed, apart from, you know, considering gender first.
Thank you. And I'm just answering one last question, and I think we have to wrap up. Also, because we just received a question about how long the exhibition will be running, until the 25th of July. So if anybody can visit, if anybody's in Paris and wants to go see the exhibition, please do. And thank you to our audience for being with us tonight and for your many questions. I'm sorry that maybe we weren't able to answer to all of them. You can always email us at the sort of general London Art Week inquiries, and we'll try to answer to your questions. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. And I hope you've enjoyed our talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.